let's go ahead and get started. I know some more people are probably still joining us, but you folks are here. Let's begin. Welcome everyone to our Sharing Planetary Science topic on de-jargoning your talks. Several people suggested this as a topic for this year, so it's the first one out of the gate that we're doing for our seminar series this year on Sharing Planetary Science. And this seminar and all of them, we try to record them for people who had to miss them. So you are being recorded. Be aware of that. If you don't want people to see you, don't share your camera. If you don't mind, we'd love to see your faces. And let's go ahead and let you know who's with us. Sanlyn, please introduce yourself.
Good. Well, it's good morning for me, but good afternoon for all of you. My name is Sanlyn Buxner. I'm a research scientist at the Planetary Science Institute in Tucson, Arizona, and I specifically work in science education. So I am a social science researcher that works in planetary science.
And I'm Christine Shupla from the Lunar and Planetary Institute. And again, a reminder, we are recording these. So our first question for you, can you tell me a little bit about what you consider jargon to be? Does anyone want to try describing jargon? Either unmute yourself and share what you think, how you would describe what jargon is, how you would define it, or you're free to enter it into the chat box. What is jargon? So here's the point where we're asking you to share your knowledge. What do you consider jargon to be? Please feel free to talk or to go ahead and to enter your thoughts in the chat box. We've got a few different things here. Thank you. So Justin says words that only your specific community would understand, acronyms, NASA three-letter acronyms, shorthand words that we use to encapsulate high-level or difficult thoughts. Does anyone have anything else to add to any of those thoughts? Simplification. Yes, jargon, if you can simplify things by using one word instead of 10, that's great. So you are not only defining jargon, but why we use it. We use it for simplification. We use it to encapsulate high-level or difficult thoughts in science. Absolutely. Can anyone give an example of a term that you would consider planetary science jargon? Does anyone want to give some examples? And sometimes we have a different meaning behind the word. Sometimes a word is jargon when it has one specific meaning for planetary science that's different from everyday usage. Absolutely. Crater counting. That's a very specific concept. K-means clustering algorithm. Monte Carlo methods, planetary bodies, lithosphere, crust, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, lots of different things. Differentiation, absolutely. Yeah, when you talk to your average person, your average adult, let alone child, about a volatile, they might think personality, they might think somebody who's angry, they might not think about planetary volatiles. Earlier, there was acronyms and abbreviations, absolutely. So why, and any acronym really on any instrument is a form of jargon, absolutely. So lots and lots and lots of different forms of jargon. Thank you. Oh, wow. I'm not even going to try to say those, Ed. So yes, we've got lots of good examples here. When is it important to avoid using jargon? When should we avoid using jargon? And you are again welcome to unmute yourself and talk. Yep. Ed, when you're talking outside of your subfield or field, so if you're giving a talk to a large group of scientists from a variety of fields, it might be appropriate to avoid using it. when talking to the public. Absolutely, it's important to avoid using jargon. And especially with younger audiences, absolutely. Why? Why especially with younger audiences? That's a good point. And let me reiterate, for those of you who've joined in the past minute or two, if you would like to share your camera, you are very welcome to. We would love to see more of your faces. You don't have to. Liana, yes, we try not to scare away the younger audiences. We want to inspire them, and using jargon might scare them away. You don't want to irritate listeners too much. Absolutely, Zia. People can become irritated or intimidated or scared away. So there's lots of reasons to do that. Thank you. Okay, Sanlyn, you're up.
Perfect. Okay. So we just wanted to give you an example from outside of our field, right? So that we can maybe use this. And so here's an example. We will give you the reference for this. This was actually from a US News and Health report. And so here's an example of what might happen when you go to the doctor. And so, Dr. Smith, let's review the results of your blood tests. And so your CBC, BMP, and LFTs were basically negative. You have prediabetes and a slightly elevated LDL, and since your BMI is 28, you should watch your diet and exercise more to prevent metabolic syndrome. And then, of course, it's okay to keep taking an occasional NSAID with your food for your idiopathic knee pain. And so we really wanted to see in another example, right, how we might feel if we walked out of our doctor's office having heard this. And so the first thing just to think about as an exercise, even though we're doing a really nice job of doing it in our own field, is what are all the things in here that are jargon? What would we consider to be jargon from this medical example? And again, since this is not a spectator sport, we would love for you to either tell us or start listing out the things that you would consider to be jargon.
All those three-letter acronyms.
Perfect. All the three-letter acronyms. So CBC, BMP, LFT, LDL, BMI. What else? Yeah, I mean, a lot of the words, right? So metabolic syndrome. Yeah. So, for a lot of us, right, some people said everything after doctor, what's going on? And so there's a lot of words that medical professionals, and we want to think about, these are individuals that we go to and trust with our health, might be using a lot of words. And, when it comes out, what was the intention of the doctor, right? The doctor was telling this person, some of this was okay, right? And so what does the word negative mean in this case, right? Does it mean neutral? Does it mean, right? In this case, it means kind of normal. And so you have to kind of like look up all these words and go, well, what does a BMI of 28 even mean, right? And so all of these things, when we start to think about what's going on, and then we want to think about the intentionality. And I think that that's really important when we think about our own talks. What is it that we want people to know or do after they leave our talks? And so we even have to ask ourselves, what would this doctor want us to know or do? And have they gotten across the point, right? And so how would you feel, right, when you left here? Anyone wants to share how they would feel? I can share how I would feel. Yeah, exactly. I would feel confused.
I would probably go and try to look up everything and then try to remember what my results were so I could look up what I was, yeah.
Yeah, and like I said, we'll put, if any of these things, so I'm more than happy. By the way, I had to look up what these words were. So, right, a lot of us have a lot of education, and I still had to go and look up what all these words meant. And so I can tell you, because I did look it all up, to figure out what those words are, right? So your, basic metabolic panel. We have to figure out what that's made up of. And so there's just a lot of stuff. And so we wanted to give you an example from outside planetary science to think about how you would walk out. And then really, again, thinking about what the goal of our talks are. And so getting our intentionality. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. And so there is a lot of research on jargon, and Christine said, new paper that she'll be able to share with you. But, from the cognitive aspect, what happens to people when they hear jargon? And so, again, big takeaway messages, and we have the citations here, is that it's really disrupts your ability. So once you're like churning on trying to figure out what that word meant or what it is, if it's not fluid, it really does stop even another scientist from processing what's going on. One of the things that we have found is that jargon actually makes it so your audience may not even identify with you or identify with science. And I think for a lot of us, we want them to feel included. We want them to be interested and identify. We don't want to turn them off and make them feel silly. It may undermine your goal. And again, thinking about the goals that you have for your talks, whether it's a public audience or maybe another scientific audience outside of your particular field. And so everyone, all of us, will really benefit from thinking about what jargon, and we're going to have this discussion, what jargon is important and what jargon should we break down so that we can have much more clear communication, again, with public audiences, education audiences, and also fellow scientists when we think about it, because we want to be able to have a great dialogue and communication. And this really is about communication, right? We want to break down those barriers. Awesome. We'll go to the next one. And so here's kind of, and this is from AGU. So they have a nice little resource here. And so here's kind of the quick and dirty, like, is it jargon checklist that they provide to us. And so, like many of you said, do you use it only when you're talking about your science? And we mean like your specific science. It's something on the mission that you work on or in your subfield. Somebody else, actually a couple of you mentioned, does it have a different meaning in kind of every day-to-day language? So does it mean something really specific in your science versus if grandma were talking to you, right? So like I have 2 small children, and when I say certain things, they really misinterpret what I'm talking about if I'm talking about science. Friends and relatives, if they don't know what it is, always good. I always like to go to my mom and figure out if I'm doing an okay job on explaining things. This one's really interesting, and I think we're going to talk about it a little bit later, but when you defend it, I have to use it because, man, everyone should know what it means. If you're defending it because you think everyone should know what it means, we should unpack that and think about why. Why is that an important word? And then, of course, is it a barrier, right? So is it stopping people, turning people off instead of helping them? And so, again, you can go to the AGU. They have a nice little toolkit as far as jargon. We've done we just kind of wanted to talk about it, but really what we wanted to do today was do a lot of you thinking about and collaborating. And so I just wanted to take a pause at this point to make sure that I think everyone feels fairly comfortable, but I want to see if anyone else wanted to add something to this. When they think about jargon, whether you have another kind of, hey, this is how I police myself when I'm thinking about what jargon might be. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this, because I think that everyone has a lot of experience.
So this is the interactive part. Does anyone have other thoughts, other things that are on your checklist in terms of deciding whether or not something is jargon? Do you have, in addition to these, or modifications to any of these?
Or even a potential question.
I guess the one addition I would add, there are words that we use or phrases that we use in planetary science that mean different things in astronomy. So one of the things I try to do, or I try to be cognizant of, is when I'm talking, could this word be misinterpreted and could it mean something else in a very near neighbor field? So like I have a friend, Robert, who's an astrophysicist, and I'll be like, what do you think when I say this? And then I'm surprised every time he comes back and says something completely different.
And do you have a concrete example of such a word?
The one most often was the one that happened most recent. There we go. Was planetary bodies. Justin and I were editing something, and like in planetary science, we might use planetary bodies to mean any large-ish body in the solar system. So it might include maybe asteroids. It might include an asteroid itself. But in astronomy, a planetary body is a planet-sized object or larger. So if we were using it in this write-up, then that planetary body could have restricted what the audience was interpreting us to mean.
Great example. Anyone else want to share?
So, yeah, this is Germán from LPI. Maybe I would add, like, you know, like particular expressions in English. Like for instance, recently I was serving on a NASA panel, and some guy said, like, yeah, that's a boilerplate. I think that's what he said, you know. And there were two foreigners on the panel, and we were like, what? So that is not jargon per se, you know, but like those expressions that definitely Americans understand, or I don't know, British. But, you know, like foreigners like me who have spent like almost a decade here in the US, and we don't really get all of those, you know, whenever those are used, we don't get that. So that's sort of, I don't know, from time to time, that rarely occurs to me, but, you know, could happen.
Awesome. I love it. I love seeing all the ones in the. Right. Anyone else want to share other examples from your field? Because I think this is really important when we start to think about it. And it really, like I said, sometimes I'm always like, I go, oh, I didn't even think about that. So I think it's always helpful to hear other people's experiences.
And the next slide has a number of terms on it as well that we'll see if you all agree might be jargon, or if any of them are ones that you think perhaps you might disagree with. So we've got a lot of terms here and a lot of reasons to consider these different terms. So here I've got some for you. Are there any terms in here that you would disagree with as being jargon? That you think, oh, well, everyone should know what that means, and they should know, you know, it within the appropriate context. For instance, I put clay on there. Does anyone want to add? People have heard of clay before. Why should clay be on there? Or why shouldn't it be on there?
Yeah, some people use clay to refer to grain size. And some people use clay to refer to a specific suite of minerals. That's one that I see trip people up a lot.
Yeah, also clay can refer to a material like the clay that a potter would use, but also a clay mineral, which is a very specific chemical structure. Yeah, that's a real rough one.
So most of the time, if you say clay to your average person out there, they might think pottery.
Yep, or soil here in Houston.
Yep, somebody put down soil earlier. I also put down habitability. Time scales. People think about things as being modern or young. Time scales, geologic time scales and planetary time scales are so very different from what most people think of. Yes, Andy, Play-Doh. Clay is equal to Play-Doh to most people. Absolutely. Modeling clay. Habitability. What does habitability mean to most people? What do your average public assume when you say habitability? What are they thinking of? Can animals survive it? Or even more, can humanoids, aliens, there's intelligent aliens there because you said it was habitable. So they often assume an oxygen atmosphere or alien life. Absolutely. And yes, they absolutely can do. They automatically assume that maybe we could send people there. You just said it was habitable. Why can't we send people there? Why can't they live there? So different terms mean different things to different folks. And Herman, like you said, different phrases. Phrases imply different things to people, especially when it's a phrase that is a colloquialism. It's something that means something to a specific culture. And we'll talk about presenting to different cultures and the issues there during one of the upcoming sessions again this year. Let's go ahead and move on. I wanted to talk a little bit about the audience, because the use of jargon will depend in part on what that audience knows. What terms are jargon to different audiences will also depend on which audience you're talking with. If you are presenting to children, they'll know the names of the planets, but they're unfamiliar with things like density. So if you're talking about density in your presentation, they might be thinking that you're talking about people who are particularly dense in terms of their understanding. Who knows what they'll think? It's something that they don't have. And gravity, there's a lot of misconceptions about gravity and what it is, and children really don't understand gravity at all. Many adults don't either, but older children, they'll know some things. If you're getting up to the middle school age, around 11, 12, they might have been introduced to plate tectonics. But if you start talking about faults and tectonism, they will assume that you mean that that object has plate tectonics because they've never been introduced to any other kind. And if you talk about faults, they think that you're talking about character flaws, not necessarily about features in the ground. They might not be familiar with any other features aside from craters. Most of them by then will have heard about craters, impact craters, and volcanoes, but other features they won't have thought of too much about when it comes to planetary bodies. And your average teenager and adult doesn't remember anything in terms of science that they learned after grade 6 or 7. So they don't really know a whole lot more than what the kids do in general. However, there are also specialized audiences, right, that we each deal with. How can you find out more? How does this difference affect your presentation, and how can you and your use, what words you use, and how can you find out more about what your audience is going to know? Any suggestions?
Talking to family and friends with kids of that age. I don't know, just like reaching out, like, yeah, I would talk to people.
Talk to somebody who knows that age, family and friends, absolutely. Absolutely. Any other ideas?
What about preparing for a classroom visit? I know that often scientists, especially now, are being asked to do virtual presentations. What's a strategy for preparing for a classroom presentation?
Is there someone besides family or friends that you could talk to if you were invited to go give a classroom presentation? The teacher, absolutely. The person who asked you to give the talk. Both excellent answers, yes. So whoever asked you to give the talk to them, maybe even run the talk past them beforehand. And if you have an education specialist like Sanlyn or myself or Sherelle in your institution, ask us and we're happy to help you. So all great answers. Okay, so audiences. Let's talk about some of these different audiences. If you were asked to give a classroom talk to a group of 12-year-old students who are studying plate tectonics, they tell you that they're studying plate tectonics, are there some words that you should use in your talk if you are talking with a group of 12-year-old students who are studying plate tectonics that you would intentionally want to use with that particular audience that you wouldn't necessarily for those 8-year-old Girl Scouts? Yes. Cheryl says yes. Did anybody have any examples of specific words? Convergent and divergent and transform boundaries. Thank you. Yeah, Cheryl is a teacher, so she knows all about those 12-year-old students. Crust and mantle and core, absolutely. So words that you can be using with those students to reinforce what they're learning in the classroom. But you might want to spend a little bit of time talking with them during the use of those words to make sure that they understand what you're saying. So for instance, for convergent and divergent and transform boundaries, you could also use your hands as an example to be talking about convergent and divergent and transform boundaries. Core and the mantle and the crust, you can reinforce it with pictures. Talk about the different crustal features. Absolutely. Are there terms that you might be comfortable using with Girl Scouts if you are talking to a bunch of 8-year-old girls? Your goals there are going to be different, right? If you're talking to students in a classroom, the teacher wants those students to be learning something. Whereas if you're talking to Girl Scouts, they may not really care to learn a whole lot about plate tectonics, for instance. What sorts of words might you be able to use, though, with 8-year-old Girl Scouts? Or an amateur astronomy club, or seniors at a museum like Space Center Houston, or undergraduate science majors at a planetary event. Can you go ahead, rather than spending lots of time on this slide, anyone want to expand on this idea? What words would you be more comfortable using with any of these audiences? Anyone want to share? I think it's late in the day and people are getting tired. We're going to move on. But of course, the point is, you would want to reinforce their knowledge if you know the undergraduate science majors. There's certain terms that you could use with them as long as you and it goes back to that point that Sanlyn was talking about earlier. If it's a word that you think that they really need to know, if there's a chance they don't know it, you could use that term and talk a little bit about that term in your presentation, if it's a word that you feel strongly they should know. Okay, so we have a task here. We have an activity that we're going to spend a little bit of time in. So we would like a few of you, let's say 5 of you, to take the challenge where we're going to ask you to describe your work in about 30 seconds without using jargon. And so I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to think. And we're going to ask for volunteers. And then after your 30-second brief presentation, and I'd very much like you to say something out loud. So do we have 3 or 4 or 5 people who are willing to talk?
And we just want to say this is a super safe place, right? So like it's a great opportunity for you to try it out, and then we go, I don't know, that might be jargony. But that we think it's a great opportunity for you among all of your friends to try it out.
I can go ahead. I get this question a lot, so no problem. What I typically say to my colleagues or friends is like, I study Mars. I am interested in the weather and climate of Mars, and for that I analyze measurements taken from satellite and from little rovers at the surface of Mars, and that's it. I mean, I typically go with weather and climate, even though what I do has to do more with thermodynamics, radiation, and stuff like that. But I say weather, and that's it. Everyone is satisfied.
Excellent. Does anyone have any thoughts or feedback on what Herman just said? I think weather and climate is great. Sometimes people might, there's a few people who don't know the difference. So if you have a chance later to expand on the difference, you could, but they've at least heard both terms and they have a picture in their head about what both terms mean. So that's great. One person recommended, one scientist described the difference between weather and climate. Weather is what, climate is what you have in your closet to wear, and weather is what you put on that day. So anyway.
I think another piece, though, we hear a lot with children, is really understanding the difference between a satellite and a lander or a rover, because they'll nod their head. And so when you ask them, sometimes you need to talk about like where a satellite is in relation to something on the ground. And so again, especially with younger audiences, we find that they kind of have an inkling, but they don't really know. And so it's something you might want to just kind of unpack for them as well.
Whereas pretty much most adults do. So awesome. Great points. All right, Ed, you volunteered. Let's have you go next. You've got 30 seconds to describe what you do.
Okay. I do S-band planetary radar observations of planetary bodies using the Arecibo Observatory. When I observe Mercury, for example, I use long code modulation with a 10 microsecond baud. I do 2 samples per baud of the received echo to achieve a 5 microsecond delay resolution. Because we transmit circularly polarized light and receive the echo in both OC and SC, we can do polarimetric studies of the surface of Mercury, which allows us to constrain the dielectric properties of the regolith. Via methods such as a k-means clustering algorithm, I can study the variation in the radar properties of Mercurian terrains and how that relates to this composition. An example is we identified ice in PSRs.
Okay, so how did Ed do?
Yeah, how did I do?
1 out of 10.
Ed was our guinea pig. We asked him in advance to use a lot of jargony terms. And frankly, we were going to ask you to pick out like 5 of them, but boy, there were a lot more. Does anyone want to share any of the words that he used that were jargony that we should avoid using? Because I don't even know how to write down half of those. SS and OS? Absolutely. Yes, that's true. Ed used the words I and we, so there were some words that weren't jargon. Okay, SC and OS. Anything else that anyone wants to throw in there? And yes, Kelly pointed out, at this point, she still doesn't know what you do. Actually, Ed, can you give us a really short, nice example now of what you do?
I use a telescope in Puerto Rico to send light to a planet. And then I look at the light that comes back to map that planet and understand the type of soils that are on there, if there's ice somewhere, like water ice, and where there are craters.
Awesome. Awesome example. Do we have anyone else who would like to go now? We don't have any other guinea pigs for this. Do we have anyone else who would like to try? Pat, awesome. He can go and he's real. Pat, please go ahead and share. Your turn.
I'm totally real. Okay, I'm not a plant or anything. Okay, I just wrote up a short one. It's like using information from spacecraft, I study the strong outer shells of planets like Earth, Venus, and Mars to figure out where and how they break and where stuff comes up from inside to make volcanoes and how the volcanoes change over time.
Awesome. Does anyone have any thoughts about what Pat just said?
Yeah, when he mentions shells, I think of seashells.
Okay, so so maybe adding one more word for shells for depending on the audience, of course, it all depends on the audience. Everything here depends on whether we're
Well,
talking about.
if I was saying this, I would have a picture of a round shell of a planet. You know,
Okay.
I would have visual guidance for that. So
Absolutely.
I feel like I'm covered there, but yeah.
Okay.
Taken.
Okay. But very nice though. I especially like, stuff that's underneath that comes up, and that was very descriptive.
Gooey stuff from inside. Yeah,
Gooey stuff from inside.
The crunchy shell and the gooey center. Yeah. Well, there's lots of good chocolate analogies. I was thinking of when you were talking about what you say to what audience, because you could use like a Snickers bar where you pull it apart and the chocolate part breaks and just snaps off into like pulp, and the stuff underneath it is gooey, and it's a really good Planetary analog.
Perfect. Brilliant. I like that. Well, of course I like it. I love chocolate, but so do most of our audiences. So, thank you, Pat. Thank you. Snickers, Reese's, yep.
I think caramel is better for this than peanut butter, I think.
Caramel is definitely much gooier than peanut butter, but yes. Does anyone want to add something short in the chat? Does anyone have like a short one sentence that they want to add in terms of the description of what they do? Break moon rocks for a living. That's awesome. I like that very much. That's wonderful. I look for germs on other planets. Lovely, lovely. Study bacteria and fungi that eat rocks. Nice. Nice. Depending on the age, again, you might have to define fungi. Kids, once they've gotten to like 6th and 7th grade, they've learned it. Teenagers, by the time they get to 9th and 10th grade, they might have forgotten it. But yeah, make and study fake rocks from Mars and Venus. Awesome. But yeah, lovely. These are all wonderful. These are all wonderful. We'll give folks 10 more seconds. A nano artist. I carve things up using an ion beam. Wow. Study rocks from other planets that fell on Earth. Very nice, Uliana. Zia, you might have to, depending on the audience, again, you might have to define nano and ion, depending on the audience. But yeah. Okay. We have some resources that we're going to be, and there's going to be a handout online that has information that earlier from AGU. There's something called a De-Jargonizer online that you can put in text and it'll give you feedback. We've got a handout with a general understanding of planetary science depending on the age that you can use to kind of see where the audience is at in terms of what they know and what they don't know. So we've got some different resources for you. Does anyone have any additional thoughts or questions that they would like to bring up or point out in terms of how you might decide what is jargon and what isn't, and how you could prepare to avoid using jargon? Because how can we take what we just talked about, what you've said, how can you be thinking about this and avoid using jargon? Any other thoughts?
Yeah, this is Alan. I'd like to know how you judge where the audience is. Oftentimes I speak to very mixed groups of people and find some that, like our cosmic exploration series, some that are professional astronomers and others that have no science background at all. How do you tell that, and how do you place a presentation for a group like that?
Well, before I answer that, I wanted to see what everybody else thinks. Folks, do you want to share? What do you think? How can you tell where your audience is at? What sorts of feedback can you get to help determine whether what you're saying is appropriate for their level? You're standing in front of a large public group that has young adults and seniors and maybe even a couple kids. So Ed, you asked for the age of the group before you go? And then he asks me or Sherelle to tell him what to expect for that age. Absolutely.
I guess you talk to the organizer, right? That's the first thing that you do, like
talk to the organizer. Absolutely, absolutely. Let's say the organizer says, there's going to be a bunch of kids, and you in your head are thinking there's 8-year-olds, and you get there and there's 6-year-olds or 4-year-olds, kids sitting in their parents' laps. That changes everything, right? Or, so you're surprised. Or during the talk, you prepared in your head for one group and you're watching them. Are there certain things that you could be doing during your talk to be getting feedback from them, to have an idea in terms of whether they're understanding and what their reactions are? Sanlyn, I'm going to let you talk.
Yeah, no, so some of the things we've done with our audiences is we get them in on it. So we might say, gosh, if you hear a word that you don't know what it means, we've given everyone a pink card and we want you to hold it up so that we can get people holding up pink cards. And then you're talking along and you start off by having them do an example. So you might even do an Ed example of doing a very, so they feel really encouraged to be bold and tell you they didn't know what happened, right? And so that's one way we kind of get our audiences into it, to tell us, like, we want you to tell us when we've said that something you don't understand. And so that's one way we've actually worked on that. Everyone's looked at people's faces, right? And so it's one of those things where you're watching their face and maybe they're starting, and so one thing that I think a lot of scientists find a lot of success in, regardless of whether you're using jargon or not, is just going back and forth, right? You don't want to just talk and not get feedback from your audience. And I know that there have been other seminars where you're talking about this and you'll continue to talk about, but continually checking in to make sure, right? Is this going okay? Are we still engaged? And so kind of having more interactive things also works.
Exactly. If you can, of course, depending on the audience, they may not want to interact. If you have a group of senior citizens, they may not want to hold up cards. You might be able to get them to do it. On the other hand, they might like, I came here to listen. I came here not to do anything. So I'm not going to say anything. But you could always engage them in addition to watching their faces and seeing if they're nodding or if they're not nodding. You can also invite them to share hand signals or ask questions that don't really require that they say anything, that only require that they enter something. So something that requires that they vote if it's a virtual program, something that requires a hand signal, a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So right now, all of you, if you click on where it says participants in this program, you can look at everybody's names. You see that there's a number of things there. I could ask you to say something. Let's ask you, would you be comfortable if you were giving a talk, inviting the audience to give you a thumbs up if they agree with something? Go ahead and click yes if you would be comfortable asking them to give you a thumbs up. If that's something that you think you wouldn't really be comfortable doing, or you think it might be inappropriate, give me a no. Give me an X, a no. If you think that that's not something you'd be comfortable doing in a talk. And so I see a number of symbols. I see some yeses. I see some thumbs up. And some of you just don't feel like responding. And you're going to get audience members that don't feel like responding as well in anything that you do, unless you set off from the beginning as making it a clear expectation where you expect everybody to participate. So you could ask a question where you invite everyone to vote and use a hand signal. You ask them a question, and Alan, your question about telling what they know, if you ask a question that uses a little bit of it and isn't a question where they are right or wrong. So you don't want to make your audience feel foolish or stupid, but a question that gets their opinion, and they get to pick a symbol, like a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4 or a 5, your opinion about something, and gives them a chance to hold up a number of fingers, polite fingers, I usually say, but give them a chance to vote. That's another way. But if you're getting reactions from them during the talk, that helps. And then there's also certain things that you should just, too many adults, let alone children, do not know how to read a graph. If you're giving a public talk, you should probably avoid graphs because too many people just have no idea how to read them or interpret them. There are certain words that we've already discussed that you might want to avoid with any audience, and if it's really critical, then you should explain it, but recognize you're going to be taking time to explain it. And then practice. The more that we talk with different audiences and get feedback and interact with them, the better we know. Any thoughts on that from anyone, or any other questions we haven't addressed yet? Thank you so much for joining us. And Sanlyn, thank you so much for presenting. Does anyone have any final questions or comments? We're delighted to have all of you with us. Have a great afternoon, everyone. We appreciate your time and for all that you do. And we look forward to seeing you again for the next one. We'll send out announcements for the next one as soon as we have it finalized.